The first people to hear the Genesis creation story being recited some 5,000 years ago or so would have understood it much differently from the way we do today. I say heard because the story is older than writing and was passed down by word of mouth for unknown generations before it was finally inscribed on clay tablets and eventually transmitted down to us. Of course, they would have recounted the story in a structured, more poetic way because that would have made it easier to remember. They would have heard something like, "At the beginning of our world, the powers that be created in their present form everything we can see by looking up and everything we can see by looking down, and there was no sign of humanity." They would have interpreted the story to mean that the powerful ones, or the powers that be, whoever they were, transformed some pre-existing world into the limited world they could see with their own eyes. What lay above the sky, below the earth, below the surface of the sea, and beyond the limits of the horizon, that was all unknown. Early on, at least, they made no guesses as to what lay in that great unknown. In all respects, they were stuck in a constant here and a constant now. That is, a here between the horizon in that direction and the horizon in the opposite direction, and a now stuck between a past that went back no further than the memory of the oldest living person, and a future where it was uncertain if the sun would rise tomorrow. They were locked in a permanent middle, with no hard and fast boundaries. Our modern horizons have expanded beyond the ability of our earliest ancestors to comprehend. Yet in both time and space, the boundaries of our world still fade into the unknown. We don't know what happened at the moment of the Big Bang, or before, assuming there was a before. To be totally honest, we don't really even know if there was a Big Bang. Nor do we really know how the universe will end, assuming it will end. Look out into the vastness of space and you can detect hints of something unknown that's far greater than all we can see. Then look at the increasingly small bits of our quantum world that defy description. How big do things get? How small do things get? We don't really know. The stage we play on is so very much larger and more detailed than the one our remote ancestors strutted about on. But in the end, it's still just a stage. The Genesis story of creation was just that, a story. It was basically a guess told by people who knew very little to explain the world they saw around them. We humans have always come up with such stories to explain the things we see. It's in our nature. Those stories that are better at explaining how our world works, we keep. The ones that don't do such a good job, we throw away. For most of the time since the first stories were written down some 5 millennia ago, our understanding of the world around us was limited to only what we could directly see with our own eyes, and our stories changed slowly. With the invention of telescopes and microscopes at the end of the 16th century, we had a way to take a close look at what was around us, and we were amazed. Whole new worlds came into view. The small worlds were populated with all sorts of bizarre creatures made of large molecules, which in turn were made of atoms. The more we learned, the more complicated and weirder our stories became. So much so that these days it's pretty hard to know what these stories are even about. Eventually, the things we were focused on became so small we could no longer directly see them with our eyes, even using the most powerful microscopes. So we did what humans always do. We invented a new story. Only this time, because we could no longer see what was going on in the world around us, we used math to invent our newest stories. My doctorate was based on the idea that because of the way our eyes are constructed, they divide up the spectrum of visible light in distinct areas, which in turn determine how we see and name colors. A simple idea, really, when you stop and think about it. This was my story. In order to see something, we need light, an electromagnetic wave. This wave hits the surface of something and gets reflected into our eyes. The wave carries information from the object that our brain uses to create an internal image that we then use to understand what's happening in the world around us, so we can respond accordingly. But early in my studies, I ran up against an incredibly big problem. No one knew how the process worked. Oh, we knew bits and pieces, all right, but how the images created in our brain became part of our conscious mind was a complete mystery. We have a brain, and we have a conscious mind. Yet no one had any idea how the working brain produced a conscious mind. Even with the aid of CAT scans, MRIs, and the like, we don't have a clue how the information received from our senses allowed us to know what was going on in the world around us. In fact, no one even had a good idea about how the process might work. Philosophers and scientists have been trying to figure that one out for centuries, and we were no closer to an answer when I was at university than the ancient Greek philosophers had been over 2,000 years before. But what if we had gotten it all wrong? I mean all of it, starting from the beginning. Let's take a quick look at what until recently were some of science and philosophy's most important assumptions about how the process worked. Say you're looking at an object, a red object, a crayon or a tomato or an apple, or even a paint chip from the paint department of the local building supply store. And that red object is an arm's length in front of you. We assume, first of all, that the object has an independent existence. That is, that the object is in some sense real. This would mean that when we close our eyes, that red object is still an arm's length in front of us. Of course, not everyone agreed with this. A minority of scholars have always claimed that when we close our eyes, the red object ceases to exist. In fact, they claim that the only thing we can really know exists is the self. This belief is known as solipsism, and even Einstein got caught up in this debate between the majority and the solipsists. The universe, as he saw it, was strange enough to support either side. These two beliefs, that reality exists independent of us and that we create it in our own mind, have been arguing against each other for almost as long as we have been curious about the nature of our world. But the two ideas didn't have to be, strictly speaking, mutually exclusive. So it was only a matter of time before yet a third group of scholars came up with a third possibility. External reality exists, but we create an imperfect model of it in our minds, an imperfect model that we use to understand everything. And it's the internalized model that disappears when we shut our eyes. How that internal model got into our conscious mind, however, was still a total mystery. But is it possible that we have made a fundamental mistake? Could it be that when we open our eyes we are interacting with some reality, but that reality is significantly and arbitrarily different from what we experience? And that our senses are not tuned to show us that reality, but have evolved to actually hide it? For well over a century, the experts have assumed that when we look at the world around us, our eyes show us reality, or truth, by which we mean that our eyes show us with a fair degree of accuracy what is actually there around us. But is that true? The rear third of our brain is engaged in vision. When we open our eyes, billions of neurons and trillions of synapses spring into action, and within about 100 milliseconds construct an internal image of everything we consciously see. What we see, we understand almost in real time. That's where our knowledge stops. Like the rest of the scientific world, I used to think that the internal image we constructed was a kind of model of reality that was a pretty accurate reflection of what was there in front of us. At least it was accurate enough to allow us to interact with the things around us with a fair degree of success. Enough success at least so we could avoid danger and find food. Now I think that what we construct is something entirely different. The clues that we do not construct an accurate internal model were all there for us to see. We were just misinterpreting them, or at worst, ignoring them. Could it be that there is such a thing as reality, but that we don't actually see it because we can't actually see it? To explain what I mean, we'll have to start with a look at the brown jewel beetle. The female jewel beetle is flightless. The males fly around looking for females to mate with. The males know, in quotes, they found a female of their own species when they spot something that is shiny, dimpled, and the right shade of brown. When they spot something with these properties, they land and mate. The problem is that there were other things in the environment that are also shiny, dimpled, and the right shade of brown, but that were not female jewel beetles. These non-female beetle objects were empty beer bottles. And unfortunately, the empty beer bottles turned out to be much better at triggering mating behavior in the males than the female jewel beetles were. That is, to the males, the beer bottles were hotter and sexier. They were so much sexier, in fact, that the males kept mating with them, and the brown jewel beetles almost went extinct. The male jewel beetles saw only what was absolutely necessary for them to identify a female jewel beetle, and until humans introduced beer bottles into their environment, that was sufficient to maintain the beetle population. Seeing more than these three characteristics would come at a biological cost. Yet it would not have increased the jewel beetle's reproductive success at all. Evolutionarily, it would have been a waste. The animal world is full of examples of this. Dragonflies need water in which to lay their eggs. They identify water by the fact that the light bouncing off of it is horizontally polarized. But a couple of things humans have introduced into the environment also reflect horizontally polarized light, and do it better than water: oil spills and polished gravestones. So it's not uncommon for dragonflies to lay their eggs in oil spills or on polished gravestones. And without water, the young dragonflies will not live to pass on their genes. All animals with eyes have such visual shortcuts for a variety of purposes, including the identification of a potential mate, at the lowest biological cost that will keep the animals alive long enough to reproduce and to pass their genes on to the next generation. Like jewel beetles and dragonflies, we see only what is necessary for us to live long enough to reproduce and pass on our genes. The technical term for this is fitness. Anything that helps us to pass on our genes increases our fitness, and anything that prevents us from passing on our genes decreases our fitness. Most things do neither, thus have no effect on our fitness at all. Okay, let's take a step back for a minute and see if we understand this. We do not actually see what is in the world around us because we evolved from animals that don't accurately see the world around them. What we do see is only what we need to see to pass on our genes. Most scholars assume that getting as accurate an understanding of the world around us as possible would be a great help in increasing our chances of survival, thus increasing our fitness. and thereby increasing the probability of us passing on our genes. However, it turns out that fitness and reality are not even related. How do we know this? The theory of evolution is a mathematically precise theory. Evolutionary game theory and genetic algorithms allow us to think up all kinds of possible scenarios and run them in computer simulations. Chetan Prakash ran over 1 million computer simulations, testing every conceivable situation. The results of all these simulations invariably pointed to the same totally unexpected end result. It seems that not only have our eyes not evolved to accurately show us what is in the world around us, but the probability that our eyes evolve to accurately show us what is in the world around us always goes rapidly to zero. There is absolutely no benefit for us seeing reality, but there is a high cost. Evolution does work to increase our evolutionary fitness at the lowest biological cost possible. In ordinary language, what Prakash showed was that our eyes have evolved to see what we need to see to have the best chance to pass our genes on to the next generation. Nothing more. In essence, our eyes have evolved to increase our fitness, not to show us reality. The exact opposite of what scientists and philosophers had always assumed. So if we're not seeing reality, what are we seeing? And more interestingly, what is it that we are not seeing? Here's where we need the Hoffman desktop interface analogy. What we see is not reality, but the equivalent of the desktop on a computer. A computer desktop hides the reality of what is going on inside the computer while allowing us to accomplish tasks by manipulating icons on that desktop. We don't actually see the integrated circuit chips that are composed of atoms, which in turn are composed of particles, which are themselves composed of subatomic particles, some of which make up what we call electricity, to give the binary code that runs the computer a form of utility. What we do see is representations of things, icons, and representations of actions that cause analogous processes to occur in the computer. We are almost at the point where we can use holograms as our desktops, so we could manipulate icons in a 3D space. In much the same way, what we perceive as 3D space is the desktop for our species, Homo sapiens. And physical objects in our world are really icons on that desktop. Those objects are not there to show reality, but to guide our behavior in ways that increase our fitness. The obvious objection to this is that if I see a car zipping along on the highway, if I think it's just an icon, I should be able to step out in front of it and not get hurt. However, I wouldn't step in front of a car for the same reason I wouldn't drag the folder icon that represents where I keep this very file into the recycle bin icon, because if I did, I could lose a lot of work. Dragging one icon to another icon is only a representation of what would happen inside the computer. In the computer, the file that holds my work would be made to disappear, and the space where it resides on the disk would be reused for something else. Thus, I don't take the icons literally, but I do take them seriously. Not stepping out in front of what I see as a speeding car prevents me from being hurt in the same way that not dragging the folder icon to the recycle icon prevents my work file from being deleted. Evolution, it seems, has given us icons that help to keep us alive, not to show us what is really there. What Chetan Prakash showed in his simulations was that the ability to accomplish things accurately does not require that we know anything about reality, just that we act appropriately. Like the brown jewel beetles and dragonflies, we have evolved to see only what we need to see in the way we need to see it. Interestingly enough, This means that the brown jewel beetles, dragonflies, and all other animals with visual or other perceptual senses have evolved their own species-specific desktops. Evolution has shaped us to be able to interact with some reality without telling us anything about the nature of that reality at all. Okay then, what is the nature of that reality? Several groups of scientists have been working on that problem. One of them has come up with a concept that is mathematically elegant, from which it appears they can derive all of modern physics, that provides solutions to some long-standing problems such as quantum gravity, and that gives testable hypotheses. For those without a mathematical background, this is a stunning claim. While I've personally found the mathematical details of this conscious realism theory, as they call it, to be extremely compelling, mathematics is an acquired taste. So I'll stick to the non-mathematical descriptions from here on. The conscious realism theory says that consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality, and the world consists of things called conscious agents. Every aspect of consciousness can be modeled by systems of these conscious agents. What is a conscious agent exactly? Well, I guess I lied when I said no more math. A conscious agent is defined mathematically as a sextuple made up of 3 Markov kernels, 2 probability spaces, and an integer counter. Okay, let's assume the math is right and the conscious realism theory is correct. What does all this mean? The theory says that what exists in reality is not space-time and physical objects. What we think of as space-time is our desktop and is unique to humans. Think of the brown jewel beetle again. Their species-specific desktop solved the fitness problem for reproduction with the 3-trait combination. Anything that was shiny, dimpled, and the right shade of brown was a female. To the males, females and beer bottles were 2 instances of the same object. Their desktop had only a limited number of different kinds of icons because only a limited number of objects have an effect on their fitness. So their desktop reduces all the possible information that theoretically could reach their brains to a set of objects that stimulates behavior that increases fitness. Humans also have their desktop with their set of icons. It's a much larger desktop with lots more icons. But it's still basically just a desktop with icons. However, the desktop is not just a random construction. The mathematics tell us that it is also an error-correcting mechanism that provides us with the largest amount of correct fitness information it possibly can. On the desktop, objects or icons that may be thought of as solutions to fitness problems. To the male jewel beetles, females and beer bottles are the same object, the same solution to the same fitness problem of reproduction. Here's the theory in a nutshell. Space-time is our desktop, our error-correcting mechanism. Objects are icons that are solutions to fitness. Living things are composed of systems of conscious agents that are interacting. Conscious processes of living things are best thought of as larger systems of conscious agents. Unconscious processes of living things are best thought of as smaller systems of conscious agents. Assuming this is true, we can now state that the brain does not produce the conscious mind because the brain, like all icons, is just a fitness solution. Instead, it is a mind that produces what we think of as the brain. Of course, This last statement can be easily misunderstood because it appears to support the solipsistic belief mentioned earlier in this presentation that our minds create reality. Conscious agent theory assumes there is an external reality. We just don't see it because we can't see it. We may never be able to see it, but we can understand it mathematically. The more I wrestle with this theory, the more convinced I have become that there is something to it. There you have it. Reality exists, but it's not what you think it is. Or to be more precise, something we can call reality exists, but because of the evolutionary process, we can't see it or perceive it. Not directly. Evolution has instead given us a poor reflection of reality in the form of our species-specific desktop, a desktop which has evolved to provide us with the largest amount of fitness information that it can in the most accurate form possible. We call our desktop space-time. What we see as objects in space-time are icons on our desktop. They're solutions to fitness problems. That is, they may best be thought of as a set of traits that stimulate us to behave in a certain way, and thereby increase our evolutionary fitness. We could say that this answers the question, does reality exist, and stop here. But what comes next is even more astounding. Mathematically, we can model all of this, and in the process provide a staggeringly great leap forward in our understanding of the world around us. Thus, while we may never be able to see reality, we can understand it. And it is awesome.